the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. We are in the dog days. I don't mean to insult any dogs. The dog days of August, the hot days of August. Hot everywhere in America, except, of course, from where I am, San Francisco, where it's still the heart of winter. And what better to do on a hot August afternoon than read a novel? And appropriately enough, we have the woman who knows more about new novels, I think, than anyone in the universe, our old friend Bethanne Patrick, who's on the show to talk about the best books for August 2024. She's divided, as always, 3 books, nonfiction, and 3 novels. And so, Bethanne, let's start with fiction, appropriately enough, in the dog days of August. Interesting title, Hum, by Helen Phillips. Tell us about this book.
Hi, it's so great to be here again, Andrew. And it is the dog days, and I am in swampy DC, Metro DC. So you may see my hair blowing back because I need a fan, believe me. And in Hum, unfortunately,
I couldn't resist that.
In Hum, unfortunately, machines like fans take over a bit. And so Helen Phillips is a really terrific writer. The Need was her previous novel. And I will say that this one is about a near future society. The hums of the title, of Hum, are bots that help human beings with so many different tasks, all kinds of things. And so Mae Webb has some financial difficulties. And so she decides to take a job that requires her to undergo some facial alteration. Now, I'm not going to tell you its techniques. I won't say surgery. I won't say how it happens. But once she's done that, she decides, okay, I'm going to take my husband and our children to this place called the Botanical Gardens. And while they're there, they're having a wonderful time. This is a botanical gardens. It's more like a theme park than an actual botanical gardens. One of the kids wanders off, and we all know as parents that that is a great fear. What happens next, though, is an even greater fear. Because of that facial alteration, she's not recognized by the system. And so Phillips is reminding us that progress always has pros and cons. And so the robots, even though we think, oh, that's terrible, they're the least eerie part of this book. I highly recommend it. I love Phillips's writing so much. And I just want to say, it doesn't feel like science fiction, even though she's writing about a near future dystopia. It feels so full of humanity and so full of care for what's happening to this family. So, it's a great read. It's a great.
So coming back to the idea of a dystopia, Bethanne, does this enable her to escape surveillance capitalism, as some people call it, or is it dystopian in the sense as a nightmare that no one knows who she is anymore?
It's both. That's what's so great about Phillips. So the reason she's undergone this procedure is because it's experimental and the system wants to find out who might be able to evade it, right? But at the same time, it makes her unrecognizable to that system, and they don't want to let her back in, and they don't want to let her have her child back. That's the real nightmare. So, she's very humorous, even in situations that are horrific.
You mean so, Helen
Phillips? Yeah. And so one of the reviewers of the book noted that in the last bit. I don't know if these are the exact last lines because I don't have the page right in front of me, but it's very, very close. Someone says, did you know that people can know how old a woman is by the way her hands look, even if she's otherwise well preserved? So it's a comment also, not just on identity.
Just raised your hand, Bethanne. That was
I
it.
know.
Freudian slip. 2 hands now. Now we know how old you are.
There's no way from these hands to know how old I am, which is very funny. It's something my mom has always commented on. Your hands look like they're little children's hands. And so a weird advantage for me. But I will say,
if you want to look younger than you are.
If you want to look younger, some of us,
if you want to look older and more astute, then maybe
that's right.
It's a problem.
To have gravitas, you need to have wrinkled hands, I guess. But I really hope that people will pick this up and not be put off by the sci-fi elements. It's very good.
Well, if you do pick it up, make sure you cover your hands. When it comes to being recognizable or unrecognizable, your second novel also kind of touches on it, The Hypocrite by Joe Hamya. It's a book about how our close relatives, our parents, our children become unrecognizable over time. Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair. And in fact, I think that is such a good way of describing the hypocrite. As I was telling you earlier, Joe Hamya is a beautiful young brown woman. She has chosen, because she lives in London, to write about a family who are not recognizably brown or of another race or culture. This is very much set in sort of a walled garden kind of a novel. What happens is you have a young woman playwright, and she has a new play finished, and she invites her father to its premiere. He doesn't know that it's all about him. He is a 60-something novelist who's had some trouble getting, new work done himself. And he is very shocked and angered and disappointed and saddened to find out that the play is about a vacation he and his daughter took in Sicily when she was a young teenager. Meanwhile, upstairs, the mother of his ex-wife, that is, and the mother of the playwright are having lunch. And so she's hearing her mother's views about women, about how her father treated women over the years, and also about how her father treated her. And so at first you think the hypocrite of the title could be any of these 3 people in this family, right? But it's not. It doesn't matter that much as the story progresses who the hypocrite is, because it's all of us. And one of the things I want to make sure to mention about this one, Andrew, is that several reviews, several critics have pointed out, oh, this is a Martin Amis kind of character. And I want to take issue with that. I don't think it's fair. I think that Hamya wants the novel to inhabit, as she says, one massive gray area. And Martin Amis wasn't necessarily like this particular novelist. And Martin Amis, I don't think had...
Maybe could we say Martina Amis?
Martina, that's right. So it's, but here's, another really interesting thing. This is set in August 2020. It's in London, okay? But it is at a moment... It's at the moment of the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis. So it's a moment when the world is reckoning with the hypocrisy of Western law enforcement and the way we have set up our institutions in the West. So this is a book that tells so much about power and imperialism, even though it's just talking about 3 members of a family.
Yeah, and Bethanne, philosophers have written books in defense of hypocrisy, that it's an all too human thing, that
yes,
whether or not we like to acknowledge it, we're all hypocrites. So does Hamya, is she tolerant in a sense towards hypocrisy? If speaking of somebody like Martin Amis, if he had a philosophy, it was a toleration of
yes,
of all our weaknesses and foibles.
one of his great friends, Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens and I are poles apart on many, many things. But what I love about Hitch and I love about Martin Amis and their work, rest in peace, both of them. If they want to be in peace, maybe they want to be in lots of action. But what I want to say is they believed in thought. They believed in actual rational thought and how it could get us out of some of these very human dilemmas that very human characteristics like hypocrisy get us into. So that's what I would say. I think Hamya is incredibly tolerant of hypocrisy. She realizes we are always going to get ourselves into these kinds of situations because every story has more than one side.
Yeah, and we all change all the time as well. When daughters grow up, fathers become less and less ideal to their children as they get older.
And
both of these, sorry, go on. As you and I both know, or certainly I know, you're not a father, of course. And
no, but I was going to say, Andrew, mothers know this too. And so the mother is also in here. And that's what's fascinating, because one of the things going on is the difference between the, let's say, baby boomer mother and the millennial daughter and their views of how men should treat women. The mother has a very different, idea. She thinks things are not as serious as her daughter.
Yeah, and I think the generational quality is interesting here. I must admit, of all the 6 books here, this is the one I think I might end up reading. The generational quality, of course, Hitchens and Amis were part of a younger generation who, they may seem, well, they're all dead now, but they may seem old now or conventional, but there was a point when they were the bomb throwers. So hopefully Joe Hamya has taken their bombs and thrown them for themselves.
Incredible. I really, she's a writer to watch for sure.
Well, you run me over on that one. Finally, both these books are about hiding and unrecognizability. This final book is about hiding itself and why it's sometimes essential to hide and be unrecognizable. Our Narrow Hiding Places by Christopher Jansma. It's a novel about survival during Nazism and hiding from the evil Nazis. So tell me about this book. So many books, so many novels, Bethanne, on Nazis and war stories. Why is this one interesting?
Well, this one is interesting because, first of all, it's incredibly intense and smart. And it reminds us that even though there are scores and scores of books about World War II, scores and scores of novels about World War II, there are always stories that we haven't learned yet. And in this case, we've got a grandmother named Mika, if I'm saying that correctly, Mika, I'm not sure, and her grandson, Will, who is very much American. And he learns that she needs care. And so when he goes to take care of her, she's about 80 years old, he starts talking to her about her life. And he learns about the 1944 Dutch hunger winter, which was truly just atrocious for the Netherlands. It was terrible. Starvation was going on, but also the Nazis were trying to, rout out any people, Dutch people, who were trying to help people escape, especially Jews. And so this little girl, when Mieka was 8 years old, had to help care for her father and some other men who went and hid in the attic of their apartment building. And partly, that was to escape, being transported off to, concentration camps or labor camps, but also because there was just so little food. And so an 8-year-old girl, could more easily go out and get a scrap of this and a bit of that. But this is a book that transcends that realism in historical fiction. There are chapters, Andrew, that are narrated by eels, river eels, canal eels. And let me tell you.
So it's kind of like Gunter Grass, a mix of Gunter Grass and Anne Frank.
Yes, it's also Gunter Grass and a little bit of Borges, and it's really got some magical realism in it, which is not something I've seen with a lot of Dutch literature. Let me tell you.
So Christopher Jansma is a Dutch writer. Is this a translated
Well,
novel?
no, he actually is American. He's the director of the writing programs at the State University of New York at New Paltz, but he does have a Dutch background. There are also Dutch fairy tales that come into this. So there is a lot going on in this book besides the interaction between a grandson and his grandmother. But I think it's a very important book because it shows that family splintering can almost always be somehow repaired. It's about bringing members of a family back together, and Mieke and Will bond over his care for her and over her honesty about what has really happened to his father and grandfather.
So in a sense, it can be read in parallel with The Hypocrite.
It can. It absolutely can. And I'm telling you, do not be put off by the talking eels. They are really fantastic. It's compelling.
So we've got 3 excellent novels, or excellent sounding novels. I have to admit, I haven't read any of them. I know Bethanne, of course, has read The Lot. Hum by Helen Phillips, The Hypocrite by Joe Hamya, Our Narrow Hiding Place by Christopher Jansma. We're going to take a short break. I want to thank our friends at Liberties who've been very supportive of this show. I know they love Bethanne's monthly summaries. Liberties Quarterly is an excellent new publication. A lot of nonfiction, but also they have some excellent fiction writers. Culture and politics they focus on. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Bethanne to talk about her 3 nonfiction choices for August. Don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with my favorite monthly guest, Bethanne Patrick, the book critic of the Los Angeles Times and the best read woman, I think, in America. Bethanne, you mentioned Martin Amis in the first part of the show in terms of the novel The Hypocrite by Joe Hamya. He also comes up in your first nonfiction recommendation, Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich by Richard Evans. Evans was actually on my show talking about the Nazis. He's perhaps the world's most authoritative and trusted scholar of Nazism. And he spoke, I think, in detail with Martin Amis about Amis's novel of the Nazis, which of course got turned into an Oscar-winning film. Maybe we can talk about that as well. But what is it about Hitler's People that you particularly enjoyed? Well, I don't know, enjoyed is the right word.
No, that isn't the right word.
It intrigued you and moved you.
Yes, any more than reading, The Zone of Interest or watching The Zone of Interest is enjoyable. It is about understanding. It is about, taking something from history and also realizing, to go back to the Joe Hamya novel, where our hypocrisies lie, both personal and communal. And so, first of all, as you said, Evans is the authority about this. I have been fascinated by the communal culpability of the German people, especially during that time of the Nazis' rise to power and World War II and its aftermath. And I have a very strange little book that a friend gave me years ago called Ich weiß alles, I know everything. And it's a housewife's compendium of household tips.
And you've spent, sorry to jump in here, Bethanne, but you've spent some time in Germany.
Yes.
I know your husband was stationed over there. Do you speak and read German?
I do. I will not claim to do either one really well, but enough I can, say that I know my pronunciation, for example, is okay. And I can also read this little book. So this particular edition of it was published during the Third Reich. It uses that horrifying, it makes you grimace when you see that old style type, that they used in so many of their communications. And it was for the women who were being told, stay home, Kinderküche Kirche, right? And so it's full of all these tips of how to stretch your dollars, in a time when there was still horrible inflation in Germany, et cetera. And so that book made me think, so many of these people were completely ordinary, Andrew. They were completely, it's like, Evans divides the Germans into Hitler, the paladins, or his upper, ranks and close ministers, close confidants, then the enforcers, who are, of course, the SS and the police and everyone. And finally, the instruments. And the instruments doesn't just mean, people of lower classes. Instruments means people like Leni Riefenstahl, the filmmaker who helped get Hitler's message out. And so we all wonder, how could you do this? How could a person participate in this? And one of the things that he does note that I really thought was interesting, and I think Amos understood this when he wrote his books.
Although to be fair to Evans, I talked to him about Amos. I don't think, he's a great admirer of Amos and his writing, but I think from a historical point of view, he had some major issues with Zone of Interest. It certainly wouldn't have been the novel he wrote. Although Amos came to Evans to learn more about the experience of Nazis.
That is so interesting. There was just, unfortunately, I'm not going to remember who wrote it. In the latest New York Review of Books, there is an excellent review of Zone of Interest. And it doesn't talk that much about Amos. It really talks about the film, but it brings up some of those issues. And so what I was going to say is that Evans notes, for instance, at the paladin level, there was virulent hatred in many of these men. There's one person who was such a homophobe, one person who was so anti-Semitic. There's a lot of hatred, but Evans does say, look, that doesn't mean that they did the most damage. What happens is that all of these people fall in line and they do the damage. I'm not saying by any means that Speer and Goebbels and Himmler and all of the rest of them didn't, do incredible damage, but it takes the kind of communication that Hitler was able to do because of the communications technology that had become available. That's one of the things I think Evans is really good on in this book.
I brought this up with him, and he sidestepped it a little bit, but it's an interesting question about whether or not he shares Hannah Arendt's notion of the idea of the banality of evil. He said that term had been misused because Arendt didn't quite mean it in her analysis of her coverage of the Eichmann trial. But does evil, there's no doubt, of course, about how Hitler's people were perpetrators of the most profound evil, perhaps in human history. But do they come out rather banal, just middle-class men who were, as the Zone of Interest, especially the movie seems to suggest, just ordinary people who happen to be swept into history itself?
I actually think that one of the things Evans might have a problem with the phrase banality of evil about is that it doesn't give enough space for free will. And so in the zone of, and that's one of the things that bothered me about the Zone of Interest, as I thought, you don't have to sit there with these noises and just pretend nothing's going on. You do not have to do that. You know, you mentioned a little while ago that I happen to be a military spouse. I'm a military spouse. That does not mean that I believe in everything that the US military or Department of Defense does. And I know that. I can think about that. You do not, if you want to be in your bubble and say, here I am living in this house, and just over this barbed wire, I'm hearing screams and barking dogs and smelling smoke. You don't have to be like that. That's what the banality of evil. And I know that, as you said, it hasn't been interpreted properly.
Although Evans, and again, I don't want to promote myself too much. Some people think that's all I do, but I would suggest people watch the interview or listen to the interview with Evans, because he's very good. I'm not sure about myself. But he does stress at the end that if there is a message in the book, it is about human agency, because, of course, the book has one eye on the contemporary age, the rise of one kind of authoritarian leader or not. He's very careful to suggest that Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin is certainly anything but Hitler. But he does note that ultimately agency, for him at least as a historian, remains central in how we navigate and negotiate evil and justice.
Exactly. And I also want to point out, as I'm sure you did in your interview with him, that Evans is very careful not to draw parallels to anything that's going on right now. He wants us all to understand this period, this historical period, so that we can make our own decisions. We can use our own agency now. But he doesn't say, oh, this is just like, you know, this figure or that figure. I think that's what makes this book so amazing. He's a true historian who has done the work and the research.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's done more of the legwork than Evans.
Anyone.
This, I guess, at least from him, it's a final statement on the Nazis. He says he's sick of them, and his next book's going to be about the pandemic. But of course, it's not the last book on Hitler and the Third Reich.
Certainly not.
Other books, for better or worse. And I was intrigued by your second nonfiction book, Keeping the Faith: God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation, a book about the Scopes trial, because I thought that Summer for the Gods by Edward Larson, that won a Pulitzer, was in a sense the last word. I actually went down to LA to interview him a few months ago.
Oh, wonderful.
It was an excellent book. But this new book, Keeping the Faith: God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation, why do we need another book, Bethanne, on the Scopes trial?
Well, not in keeping with Richard Evans, the esteemed and very careful historian, I will say I think we need another book on the Scopes trial, because it tells us so much about the times we're living in right now. And also because Brenda Wineapple is an incredible storyteller. She may not be at quite the level of expert that Larson is in terms of the trial.
And that's I'm sure you've read it 10 times.
Yes.
Summer for the Gods is a wonderful book. It's a
wonderful book. But
it's truly worthy of a Pulitzer Prize.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't know, I'm not going to say whether this one is worthy of a Pulitzer Prize or not, but I will say that she shows all these facets of both of these men, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. And she shows the bad and the good. So she doesn't make Clarence Darrow into a, one-sided hero. And she doesn't make William Jennings Bryan into a villain either. Bryan was, that what we used to call a yellow dog Democrat. And in many ways, he was a progressive. He was incredibly progressive on women's rights. Unfortunately, he was also a racist. And so when this trial came up, and the Scopes trial it took place in the 1920s during a period of religious fundamentalism in the United States, mostly on the Protestant side of things. And so John Thomas Scopes, a lot of people, know the term the Scopes trial, but they don't know what it was about. So John Thomas Scopes was this mild-mannered teacher who used a state-approved textbook that had, let's say, a paragraph about evolution in it. And so when William Jennings Bryan got wind of this, in Kentucky, he said, okay, that's it. He taught evolution. We don't want evolution taught. We shouldn't be teaching evolution. Let's, take this guy to court. And so Darrow argued for freedom of speech, and he made a lot of powerful arguments, things that we all like to hear and listen to when we are for freedom of speech. But what we have to remember, and what the judge remembered ultimately, is that Scopes was not on trial for whether or not he believed in evolution. He was on trial for whether or not he'd broken a state law. And he had. It doesn't mean that he wanted to or that he was trying to, but he had. And so one of the things Wineapple shows is how there was so much brouhaha around this, so much that, made people so upset, so angry on both sides. And this is what speaks to us.
So what is that about? How? I mean, you mentioned William Jennings Bryan.
That's what I was going to say. So it's about how maybe we need to realize that the people who are on the opposite side have something of value that is in their side. It's not so much that you have to believe in a fundamentalist interpretation of scripture, but what are they looking for? What is a person who decides to call themselves a fundamentalist in search of? One of the things that happened during the trial, and Wineapple is so great on this, is that Scopes really drilled into Bryan about, do you believe this in the Bible? Do you believe this? Do you take this literally? And every single time Bryan had to say, well, no, of course I don't. I don't believe a human can turn into a pillar of salt. And so Darrow would say, well, there you go. You're not a fundamentalist. But someone who wants to believe in that. I'm not saying they're right. I'm not saying they're wrong. What are they looking for? What is missing? Maybe if we try to think about what each side is searching for, there might be a way to talk and bridge the gap.
And does this also help? I've always been interested in William Jennings Bryan. He ran how many times he lost, I think, 3 times as the Democratic candidate for president. He was a man, in a sense, he was certainly a populist, a progressive populist in some ways, but as you say, he was on the wrong side, I guess, of the Scopes trial. He was also pro-prohibition, which would put him again on the other side from progressives. What does Jennings Bryan's involvement in this teach us about populism? Should it suggest perhaps we progressives should be a little more tolerant of populists, that it's not always a right-wing phenomenon?
I think that's exactly what this shows. Whether or not, I'm not trying to speak for Wineapple, but I'm definitely saying that sometimes there is not truth in what a populist is saying. When Bryan stood up for various scripture verses, come on, they're not something you can prove true or false. Again, it's in what the motivation is. What are these people seeking? And sometimes they're seeking, solace. Sometimes they're seeking certitude. Sometimes they're seeking, just a way to live, just some way forward because they feel lost. So, yeah, I do think that populism has some things to teach us, but it's not the things on the surface. You have to dig a bit deeper.
Well, finally, a book about Putin's Russia, Midnight in Moscow by John J. Sullivan, a memoir from the front lines on Russia's war against the West. John J. Sullivan is a American diplomat. He was the ambassador to Russia between 2020 and 2022. So much anti-Russian stuff, probably most of it justified in books and in the media. Bethanne, why is this book worth reading?
Well, this book is worth reading, and it's not my usual kind of recommendation, okay? John J. Sullivan was President Trump's appointee as ambassador to Moscow. As you said, he also served under President Biden until 2022. And I think Sullivan's very interesting. He went to Brown, which is probably one of the hottest beds of liberal and progressive thought in the United States. And he got his JD from Columbia, which is also known for, fairly liberal thought. But he did wind up in this position. He was also briefly, for about 2 or 3 weeks, acting Secretary of State between I can't remember the first guy's name, before Pompeo. Oh, there we go. Tillerson.
Tillerson. Remember, he was one of the early appointees. Sick of Trump,
and one of the early. I don't know what you want to call it. One of the early levers, but Sullivan was really there and really had to live into what it meant to be in Russia. He has this great anecdote in his NPR interview about the book, about having to go to an electronics store in Moscow and try to buy an iPad, and how they wouldn't let him take it right away because, of course, they were taking it in the back to make sure that it was outfitted with all the latest bells and whistles for surveillance. And everyone knew that. He knew that. The clerk knew that.
So he was kind of in hum.
Exactly. And so he shows that there's hum again. Yeah, that the Putin regime has lied about its intentions so many times. He has met with Putin. He has a really interesting little take on that. He says he keeps everybody waiting, even the Pope. And he's very swaggery. Sullivan says he's kind of like a Michael Corleone figure, very elegant gangster. That won't surprise any of us in talking about Putin. But what I think is really important about Sullivan's book and message is that he believes a second Cold War is coming. And we've already talked about
that's not very radical. I mean, everyone's.
No, it's not radical. It's not radical. It's just that he is really showing it. He's showing it from his own personal experience. And because I personally experienced the last Cold War, I think it's really important to listen to people who are saying this is coming and Cold Wars are dangerous. Just because you think the home front is fine during a Cold War doesn't mean that there aren't dangers. And
but he talk? I'm not convinced. I mean, the Cold War is probably here, but it's a Cold War between the US and China. Does he tell us about why Russia matters? I mean, obviously the invasion of Ukraine is significant,
yes,
but it's not a major economic power or a cultural power. And in the war against Ukraine, it seems increasingly it's not a major military power either. Why should we care about Russia?
It's a major nuclear power, Andrew. That's why, Russia has
well, so is Pakistan. So is North Korea.
Yes. I'm going to start singing Tom Lehrer in a minute. First we got the bomb, and that's good because we love peace and motherhood. But they do. The problem with Putin and Russia right now is that they are on the offense. They believe we are the enemy. And so when someone has decided that someone else is their enemy, they might go after them no matter what. And so I believe that what Sullivan saw during his years in Moscow is that Putin will just stop at nothing in his pursuit of ways to damage, devil, and even destroy the United States as long as he's in power. Now,
when I look at that, I haven't seen the book, but when I look at the photo of Sullivan, he was educated at Brown and Columbia, but he has the solid looks of a typical American diplomat or bureaucrat from the 50s or 60s. Is it conceivable, Bethanne, that guys like that want to go back to the Cold War, makes them feel more secure, makes America seem more central in the world?
Well, certainly not according to Sullivan. He doesn't want to go back to the Cold War. He wants that he wants to get away from that. He believes that Putin is the one who wants to get back to the Cold War. I was very interested, like you, to see Sullivan's man, right? And to see, maybe that's what led him into, Trump's arena and circle. And that's why he was originally appointed ambassador to Moscow. I do think he was changed by that. I think I'd be very interesting to see him now and to speak with him. He sounds quite different.
Yeah, was he reward? I mean, most of these significant diplomatic appointments are rewards for something or other.
Exactly.
Was he? Did he write big checks for Trump?
I wonder, and I don't know. That's not part of my investigative work. But I will say that when you listen to him, he sounds really smart and also very gently humorous. So he might be someone who was, sort of born with that look. It's hard to say. But I do not think he wants to go. He's not someone who wants to charge back into battle. That's not what I saw in the book. That's not what I read.
I have to admit, this is not the book that I would choose. Not that I've read it, so what do I know? But I hate the title, Midnight in Moscow. What does that even mean?
Well, I think it means, midnight is always a turning point. It's a tipping point, if you will, between, the darkness and the light, right? And so Moscow without Putin could be a very different place. It could become an ally of the West, but it is a frightening picture. I do see what you're saying, Andrew, that there might be a little, scaremongering here, but if that's the case, I don't think it's because Sullivan believes, again, we should charge into battle and set up all of our various installations in Germany or anywhere again. I think it's because he found them very frightening. He found Putin and his, consigliere very frightening.
Well, it's out of The Godfather. So we've come to the moment, always the most unfair question, Bethanne. You're probably used to this before. You got one book in August. Which one of the 6 is it?
Oh, it's definitely The Hypocrite. No question.
Can I step on the scene? I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keene. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter. Just keeps on grinning. He is the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew Keene, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.